Eleanor Dawson was just the maid, invisible, unheard, forgotten inside one of the wealthiest homes in Connecticut. But when a woman screams in labor during a storm and no one can help, Ellie does the unthinkable. She saves a life. What no one knows is that Ellie once wore a white coat until a tragedy stole her name. That night, on the cold marble floor, she doesn't just deliver a baby. She ignites a chain of secrets, betrayal, and a test of character that will shake a billion-dollar legacy. Who decides what a person is worth? Their title or their truth? Stay with us until the end to find out how one woman's silent courage changes everything. The moment Lauren Kingsley let out that first scream, every conversation in the Montgomery estate died mid-sentence. Forks froze above plates, champagne flutes hovered in midair, and the pianist in the corner let his hands collapse into silence. Lauren stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her hands clutching her stomach, her back arched in shock as a second wave of pain struck like a fist from within. "Jonathan!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Guests stood up in panic or confusion. The heir, Jonathan Montgomery, rushed to her side, trying to calm her, but Lauren swatted him away, tears mixing with sweat on her contorted face. "It's too early," she gasped, her knees buckling as the satin of her dress snagged against the polished rail. In the blur of panic, no one knew what to do. The storm had drowned the roads outside, blocking the ambulance that was 30 minutes away, if it ever arrived. Staff exchanged looks, immobilized. That's when Eleanor Dawson stepped forward, slowly, as if knowing this would change everything. "I can help," she said. No one heard her. No one cared. Until Lauren screamed again, and this time Ellie didn't ask. She moved. Ellie dropped to her knees beside the woman who had never looked her in the eyes unless it was to bark an order. Lauren's face was pale, twisted with terror. Her makeup had melted, but her pride hadn't. "Don't touch me," she spat between gritted teeth. "Get someone else. Get the doctor." But no one came. Jonathan hovered nearby, paralyzed, his hand trembling near his phone that had no signal. Ellie ignored the venom. "You're going into labor," she said calmly, removing her work gloves. "Your contractions are close. We don't have time to wait." Lauren cried out again, the sound raw, primal. Ellie turned to one of the frozen maids and barked, "Clean towels, boiled water, now." That's when someone noticed. Ellie wasn't panicking. Her voice had authority. Her movements were clean, precise. She wasn't guessing. She was guiding. Lauren tried again to push her away. "You don't get to touch my baby," she hissed. "My child is a Montgomery." But Ellie's hands were already steady on her belly. "Your child," she said evenly, "is about to be born on this floor, and he doesn't care about last names. Breathe, Lauren, now." The air was thick, but the silence between contractions felt even heavier. No one dared interrupt. Jonathan looked helplessly toward the hallway, still half believing a real doctor might burst through the door. But Ellie had already set things in motion. She rolled up her sleeves, called for more cloth, kept Lauren focused through the breathing. "Count with me. In, out." She pressed lightly, feeling the pressure, knowing the signs. "This isn't your first contraction," she said under her breath. Lauren looked at her, panic breaking through her usual coldness. "It started 2 hours ago," she whispered, ashamed. "I didn't want to ruin the night." Ellie didn't answer. She didn't need to. That admission was enough. This baby had been waiting, and now he wasn't going to wait another second. When Lauren screamed again, Ellie took her hands. "It's okay. I've done this before," she said. And she had. Years ago, a different hospital, a different woman, a different life. But the motions were still in her fingers, buried beneath time and shame. Maggie, the head housekeeper, appeared with the towels, her eyes wide as she silently handed them over. "You know what you're doing," she murmured. Ellie nodded, but her focus never left Lauren's face. The moment stretched like wire. Lauren's nails dug into Ellie's forearm as the pressure intensified. "It hurts, oh God, it hurts," she wailed, her voice cracking as another contraction rippled through her. Ellie held firm, whispering soft directions, not reacting to the pain in her own arm. "It's coming, just a little more." The marble floor, cold and unforgiving, became the most sacred place in the house. There was no sterile hospital light, no machines, just sweat, breath, and one woman carrying another through fire. The guests had retreated to distant rooms, whispers bouncing through corridors. No one wanted to watch, but no one could leave. Jonathan stood like a statue, guilt and confusion etched in every line of his face. "She's not supposed to be doing this," he muttered, not sure if he meant Ellie or Lauren. But Ellie didn't flinch. She turned, locking eyes with him for the first time. "If you care about her, you'll stop looking for someone else and hold her hand." That snapped something. He moved forward, taking Lauren's free hand, tears stinging his eyes. Lauren screamed one last time, her body twisting as the final push overtook her. Then silence, a thick, unbearable silence. Ellie leaned forward, eyes sharp. "I see the head," she said. Lauren cried, whimpering now. "Please," she begged, "please let him be okay." Ellie didn't answer, didn't break focus. She moved with practiced speed, easing the child into her arms. One more second, one final pull, then the air filled with the piercing, desperate cry of a newborn. The child's voice, small but full of life, shattered the mansion's stillness like a lightning bolt. Everyone exhaled at once. Ellie sat back on her knees, holding the child in her arms, trembling but steady. The baby kicked, wailing with strength. A boy. Jonathan fell to his knees beside her. Is he okay?" Ellie looked at him, then at Lauren, who was sobbing openly now, all cruelty erased by exhaustion and awe. "He's perfect," Ellie whispered, handing the child to his mother. Lauren took him with shaking hands, her expression raw and unguarded. No more masks, no more pretenses. Ellie stood slowly, arms wet, knees aching, heart hammering. And as the baby's cries faded into small, content breaths, Eleanor Dawson looked around the room, at the stunned guests, the broken pride, the man who couldn't speak, and the woman who had nearly bled on diamonds. She had just brought life into a world that had refused to see her. A child had been born on the same floor she had mopped that morning, but what no one knew was that it wasn't just a birth. It was an opening, a fracture in the shell that held everyone's secrets tight. And as the silence returned, thicker than ever, it wasn't just a new life that had arrived. It was the beginning of a truth so sharp it would cut through every lie this house had built itself upon. The baby was wrapped in a white linen cloth and rested in Ellie's arms with surprising stillness, his small chest rising and falling like a calm tide. His warmth bled through the fabric and into her skin, grounding her in a moment she hadn't expected to feel again. As she studied his features, his rounded nose, the slight dimple in his chin, the particular shape of his eyelids, something in her gut tightened. Years of medical training, combined with the raw instincts that tragedy had sharpened, told her to pay attention. Jonathan hovered nearby, equal parts exhausted and relieved, watching her with an expression that hovered between reverence and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You saved them both." Ellie didn't respond right away. She kept her gaze on the infant, not in awe, but in calculation. Not everything was right. She could feel it before she could articulate it. Jonathan didn't notice her silence. His own mind was still back in the moments of screaming and blood and helplessness. "I don't even know your full name," he added, almost like an afterthought. Ellie looked up, met his eyes briefly, then back to the baby. "It's not important," she replied, "but it would be. Soon." A soft knock interrupted the moment. The door opened before anyone could answer, and Marcus Reynolds stepped in. His entrance wasn't dramatic. He simply appeared, like a misplaced shadow. His tie was loosened, his face was red from exertion or nerves, and his voice trembled slightly as he said, I heard about the delivery. Is everyone okay?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jonathan turned, visibly relieved. "Marcus, thank God. Everything's fine. Ellie handled it. We were going to call for you, but the phones..." Marcus nodded too quickly. Yeah, the storm jammed everything. I tried to get here sooner." Ellie said nothing. Her eyes locked on his collar. The inner rim of it shimmered faintly with a reddish glitter, the same shade Lauren had smeared across her cheek earlier that evening. Ellie's stomach coiled. "Coincidence doesn't sparkle," her mother once said. Jonathan hadn't noticed. "You should see him," he added, gesturing toward the baby. "Come closer." Marcus obeyed, stepping toward Ellie slowly, like someone nearing a cliff's edge. He glanced at the baby for a split second, then looked away. That was when Ellie saw it, the flash of something in his eyes, not wonder, not joy. Guilt. It was a fleeting look, but it screamed louder than words. Ellie's grip on the child tightened ever so slightly, not in fear, but in the way someone steadies themselves before impact. Jonathan, unaware, was smiling, naively, gratefully. "Isn't he beautiful?" he asked. Marcus nodded but didn't speak. The silence dragged. "You've always been loyal, Marcus, always dependable," Jonathan continued, his voice full of the kind of trust that blinds. Ellie watched the exchange, cataloguing every glance, every stammer. Marcus was sweating, not from exertion, but from being in the room, from being near him. "Where were you exactly?" Ellie asked, her tone even, neutral. Marcus looked at her, startled, like a deer caught mid-step. "I was checking the garage. Figured I could get the Jeep out in case the ambulance made it through," he said. "Too fast, too prepared." Ellie nodded slowly, not because she believed him, but because she wanted him to keep talking. She shifted the baby slightly, tilting him just enough to glimpse the slant of his nose again, the way his bottom lip curled inward. A quiet certainty began to settle in her bones. Something wasn't right. Not with the story, not with the baby. Jonathan, still unaware, began pacing softly, raking a hand through his hair. "I feel like I should do something," he muttered. "Something to thank you, Ellie. This was supposed to be a night to celebrate our engagement, and you gave us something no one else could." Ellie met his eyes again and gave him the gentlest of smiles because she saw something in him worth protecting. He was not a fool, just in the dark. But darkness had never scared her. She'd lived in it for years and learned how to see. "No need," she said simply. "Just take care of him." Jonathan smiled, but Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "If you'll excuse me," Marcus said suddenly, "I need to check on something." He didn't wait for permission. He was already turning toward the hallway. Jonathan looked confused. "You just got here." Ellie kept her eyes on Marcus as he left, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists. Once he disappeared around the corner, she exhaled quietly. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to start watching more closely, enough to keep her instincts awake. Left alone with Jonathan and the child, Ellie felt the weight of something ancient rise in her chest. The baby began to stir, his fingers curling into tiny fists, his mouth moving as if to nurse. Ellie passed him gently to Jonathan. He accepted him with a nervous kind of reverence, the way a man might hold a fragile secret. "Do you think he'll look like me?" he asked. The question was too casual to be innocent. Ellie paused, considering her answer. "Time will tell," she said. But her mind already whispered a different answer. "He doesn't, and he won't." She didn't need a test to confirm it. She'd spent years studying genetic patterns, facial development, inherited traits. Some things simply didn't match. But it wasn't just about biology anymore. It was about the consequences of silence and the cost of ignoring what eyes so clearly revealed. Jonathan was still looking down, his forehead nearly touching the baby's. "I hope he does," he whispered. Ellie looked away then, because she couldn't bear to meet a man's hope with the truth. Not yet. There would be a time, and when that time came, it would not be gentle. As Jonathan rocked his newborn son and murmured soft promises to him, Ellie sat back slightly and allowed herself to observe one last time. The baby's breathing was calm again, his tiny hand resting against his father's chest. But Ellie knew what she saw. She knew what glitter didn't belong on a chauffeur's collar. She knew what guilt looked like when it tried to pass for gratitude, and she knew, more than anything, what happened when people looked away from the truth until it was too late. She had done that once, long ago, and buried a piece of herself because of it. She wouldn't make the same mistake again, not for this child, not for this family. She would wait, watch, and collect what she needed, because sometimes the most dangerous lies weren't spoken. They were seen and ignored. And Ellie Dawson's eyes no longer ignored anything. The baby's cries echoed faintly through the upper hallway, muffled by thick walls and closed doors. But Ellie didn't move. She stood just outside the rear corridor of the Montgomery estate, her back pressed lightly to the wall, ears sharpened not by curiosity, but by instinct. The voices, hushed, frantic, slipped beneath the door at the far end. Lauren's tone was unmistakable, sharp, urgent, splintered with fear. "We need to erase everything," she hissed. "The footage, the logs, anything that ties back to tonight." Ellie's breath hitched, but she stayed still. Then came Marcus, his voice lower, trying to calm her. "You're panicking. No one suspects a thing. He thinks it's his." "He won't forever," Lauren snapped. "Did you see how she looked at him? That woman's not stupid. We have to shut it all down." Ellie pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself. It was no longer just suspicion, it was confirmation. The same gut-deep sensation she'd felt years ago in the trauma unit, when a patient whispered something between life and death that didn't match their chart. Her hands had trembled then too, but she'd stayed quiet, and someone had died. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Not now, not with this child. She took a slow step back, making no sound, retreating into the shadows like a ghost who'd learned how to vanish. Once out of sight, Ellie slipped into the pantry hallway and leaned against the service counter, pulling a small notepad from the deep pocket of her cleaning apron. It was worn, creased from years of being ignored, like her. With the edge of a pencil, she scribbled quickly, 1:13 a.m. Lauren plus Marcus, erase records. She looked at him. Her handwriting was clinical, neat, the kind she used to fill out patient charts in the ER. She wrote not to remember, but to act. Information was a tool, evidence, protection. For the baby, for herself. Her heart was still racing, but her hands had stopped shaking. Something was shifting inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. She flipped to an earlier page where only one name had been written so far, Caleb. That had been the first, the child she couldn't save. She stared at it for a moment, then turned the page and wrote another, Montgomery baby, unknown father. This time, she left space beneath it. There would be more to add. Ellie moved through the lower halls like someone with purpose but no place. She didn't want to go back upstairs, not yet. Jonathan would be there, resting with the baby cradled in his arms, unaware that the world was rearranging itself beneath his feet. He trusted too easily. And Lauren had counted on that. Ellie had seen the way Lauren's voice changed when speaking to him, softened, trembled just enough to elicit sympathy. But when alone with Marcus, that softness disappeared like fog burned off by daylight. Ellie had watched it all quietly over the weeks. Watched how Marcus would linger too long near Lauren's side, how Lauren's laugh turned brittle when he walked in the room. She had said nothing, because it wasn't her place. Because silence was the armor of invisible women. But now there was a child involved. A child born into a lie that could drown him if no one pulled him above the surface. Ellie looked down at the page again, at the lines she'd written. They weren't just notes, they were lifelines. She had stayed silent once and paid the price in guilt and grief. This time, she would not be a bystander. The soft creak of floorboards brought her attention back. Maggie, the head housekeeper, appeared in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Ellie, what are you doing up?" she asked. Ellie slipped the notebook behind her back. "Couldn't sleep," she answered truthfully. Maggie nodded, unconvinced. "You were always the quiet type," she said, "but not tonight. You were someone else." Ellie didn't smile. "I was who I used to be," she said simply. The words hung there, unfinished. Maggie gave her a long look. "Whatever you were, you saved that child's life. Maybe you were meant to be here tonight." Ellie didn't answer. Meant to be. Destiny was a word for people with clean slates and clear consciences. But still, she nodded and excused herself. As she walked back toward the servants' stairwell, she ran her thumb across the edge of the notebook in her pocket. It felt sharper now, like it carried weight. And for the first time in years, she felt the presence of purpose rather than pain. Back in the staff quarters, Ellie sat on the edge of her narrow cot and opened the notebook again. She flipped past the pages she'd filled with grocery lists, supply requests, and forgotten reminders. The last two entries stared up at her. Caleb, Montgomery baby. She didn't need to know his name yet. What mattered was that he existed, that he had been born into a truth more complicated than his tiny body could hold, and that he had, without realizing it, pulled Ellie back into the fire she thought she'd escaped. She scribbled another note beneath the last line. No more silence. The pencil tips snapped from pressure, but she didn't stop writing. She sharpened it with a utility blade and kept going. There was too much at stake now. The baby's cries from earlier rang faintly in her mind, and with each sound, her resolve solidified. She would stay. She would watch. She would be the hand that didn't tremble this time. For the child. For herself. And as the clock in the hallway struck 2 a.m., Eleanor Dawson closed her notebook and slid it beneath her pillow. Upstairs, the baby had fallen quiet again, unaware of the storm gathering in the spaces beneath him. Ellie lay back, but didn't close her eyes. Because she knew how truth died. It didn't scream. It slipped through cracks unnoticed until no one could find it again. But not this time. Not while she was here. Not while a child bore the weight of someone else's silence. For the first time in years, Ellie had a choice. To walk away and let the lies rot the floorboards under someone else's feet, or to stay, dig, confront, and finally let herself be seen for who she really was. And this time, she chose not to run. It began with a text message. Jonathan had just returned from a sleepless walk through the East Gardens when his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen lit up with an anonymous number and 5 words. He has the driver's eyes. Nutty. At first, he thought it was some cruel joke, maybe a jealous guest from the party, someone bitter that he and Lauren had taken the spotlight. But the words stuck like a thorn. He read them again and again. Something in them refused to be dismissed. Still, he didn't respond. He slid the phone into his pocket and walked back into the house, shaking off the unease like it was nothing more than fatigue. But it wasn't just the text. The baby had cried the night before, and when Jonathan had rocked him in his arms, he caught himself staring, studying his features, looking for himself, and failing to find it. The curve of the baby's mouth, the tilt of his brows, even the way his lips parted, none of it looked familiar. But love, he told himself, didn't need resemblance. Love just was. That was what he clung to, until the next message arrived. And then the next. By morning, the messages had become a pattern, different numbers, different phrasing, same accusation. He's not yours. The baby belongs to the man who parks your car. Ask her where she was that night. Jonathan tried to confront Lauren gently, but she brushed him off, arms crossed over her chest like armor. People are jealous, John. They don't want us happy. They're trying to ruin what we have. He wanted to believe her. God, he needed to believe her. But then came the cameras, or rather the sudden absence of their footage. The estate's security team reported a mysterious glitch only on the night of the birth. Convenient. Too convenient. Jonathan pressed for answers, but the techs shrugged. Could have been the storm, they said. Power surge, maybe. Maybe. Always maybe. But maybe was no longer enough. Lauren became defensive quickly, irritated by his tone, his questions, his silences. Do you seriously think I'd lie to you? She snapped. After what we just went through? Her voice trembled, but not in the way it used to. Not from affection, from calculation. Jonathan started hearing the way she chose her words, and more than that, the things she left out. When the invitation came, if you could call it that, Jonathan wasn't surprised. Maggie told him Ellie was waiting in the library. No explanation, no details, just a quiet, steady request. And somehow, Jonathan knew he had to go. He entered the library with shoulders already tense, heart dragging behind him like a wounded thing. Ellie stood near the window, arms folded across her chest, her face calm but unreadable. Close the door, she said. He did. What's this about? He asked, trying not to sound confrontational. Ellie didn't waste time. She held up a small notebook, old, well used. I've been writing things down, things I've seen, things I've heard. Jonathan frowned. You've been spying on us? No, she said simply. I've been paying attention, which no one else seems to be doing. She laid the notebook on the table and began speaking, not with malice, not with pity, but with clarity. She told him about the whispers in the garage, the glitter on Marcus's collar, the way Lauren recoiled at the suggestion of medical testing. She pointed out the timestamps on the missing footage, the shifts in behavior, the lies that didn't line up. Every word she said felt like a hammer striking glass. Jonathan didn't speak for a long time after she finished. He stared at the notebook, then at Ellie, then back again. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for a page she'd left marked. There it was, in clean, decisive handwriting. 1:13 a.m. Lauren plus Marcus erase records. She looked at him. His mouth went dry. Why are you showing me this? He asked, but the question was hollow. He knew why. Ellie didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, giving him room to process, to choose. You've spent so long trusting what people say, Jonathan, she said quietly. Maybe it's time you start trusting what you see. The sentence stung, but it landed. He looked at her again, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't just the woman who had cleaned the edges of his life. She had held his child before he had, saved his family while he stood frozen, and now here she was, risking her place again, for the truth. She didn't owe him this, but she offered it anyway, not because she expected something in return, but because someone had to speak what no one else would. His knees buckled slightly as he sat, hand covering his face. This can't be real, he murmured. It's too much. Ellie stayed silent. There was nothing more to say. Sometimes silence spoke loudest. After a long moment, he looked up. You're not just a maid. No, she said. I never was. That hit him hard, and harder still was the realization that he had never noticed, not her intelligence, not her strength, not even her pain. She had walked these halls as a ghost with blood on her hands, not from sin, but from sacrifice. And he had never thought to ask who she used to be. Why didn't you say anything sooner? He asked. Because no one listens until it hurts, she answered, and he couldn't argue. A fracture had begun, not just in his relationship, but in the story he told himself about who he was, and who the people around him truly were. In that library, with the weight of Ellie's words settling into his bones, Jonathan Montgomery began to see the world differently. And as Jonathan sat there, unraveling under the truth Ellie had laid bare, something in him began to crack, something carefully built, carefully groomed. For the first time, he saw Lauren not through the lens of love or legacy, but with brutal clarity. And for the first time, he saw Ellie not as a shadow in the room, but as someone who had carried a family she didn't belong to, without expectation, without recognition. A fallen doctor, a silent hero. And in his pain, the first crack in the Montgomery fortress had finally split open. Ellie didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Her job for now was done. The lie had been spoken in gold, dressed in charm and pedigree. But truth, quiet and relentless, had finally found its voice. The doorbell rang once, sharp, deliberate, and even before anyone answered it, Ellie knew something was about to change. Jonathan was in the middle of a phone call when the butler entered the study and whispered something in his ear. Moments later, an unfamiliar man in a tailored black suit stepped into the drawing room, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than most of the art on the walls. He didn't offer pleasantries. "My name is Henry Cole," he said, voice low and unshakably firm. "Legal representative of the late Robert Montgomery. I'm here to execute a clause from his private testament, effective immediately and binding." Jonathan stood up quickly, confused but respectful. "Now? Why now?" Henry's expression didn't change. "Because the clause was written to take effect after the birth of Robert's first grandchild. That child has arrived." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that asked for permission. It demanded attention. Lauren, seated near the fireplace, barely glanced up from her drink. "Whatever this is, I hope it's quick," she muttered. Henry opened the briefcase, retrieved a sealed envelope, and pulled out a letter in Robert Montgomery's unmistakable handwriting. And then he read it aloud. "To my son, Jonathan, and to the woman who stands beside him, the Montgomery fortune, legacy, and estate shall pass not through blood alone, but through proof of character. Words can lie, appearances can deceive, but integrity is something only fire can reveal." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. Henry continued without pause. "The inheritance will only be granted if, within 30 days of this reading, the woman standing beside my son is evaluated and deemed to possess the honesty, selflessness, and loyalty I believe our family must be rebuilt upon." At that, Lauren's head snapped up. "What the hell does that mean?" she demanded. Henry lifted his gaze calmly. "It means you're being tested, Ms. Kingsley, and the one chosen to make that determination is Ms. Eleanor Dawson." The room stopped breathing. Ellie's heart thundered once in her chest, but her face remained still. Lauren blinked, then laughed, once sharply. "Her? You've got to be kidding. She cleans floors." But Jonathan wasn't laughing. His mouth opened, then closed. "Why her?" he asked softly, though part of him already knew the answer. Because his father had seen what he refused to. Ellie didn't move. She hadn't spoken yet, not since the letter was read. Her silence, however, wasn't passivity, it was power. For the first time in years, she was being looked at for what she knew, not just what she did. Henry addressed her directly now. "Robert Montgomery requested your discretion, your judgment, and your moral compass. You were hired under false pretenses, yes, but with purpose. He trusted you, Ms. Dawson." Jonathan looked at her with disbelief. His father had hired her. Ellie nodded once. 6 months ago, he said he wanted to see if Lauren loved you, or your name." Lauren stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. It's manipulation from the grave," she shouted. "This woman has no right to decide anything about me or our family." But Jonathan didn't back her up. He didn't say a word in her defense. Because in that moment, even he could see it, the way Lauren trembled not with fear, but with rage. The kind of rage that only explodes when truth threatens to surface. And Ellie? She simply stood there, arms loosely at her sides, holding more weight than any briefcase could carry. Not revenge. Not pride, just truth. The room shifted then, in ways not visible but deeply felt. Maggie entered quietly, placing a glass of water on the table for Henry, as if sensing the tension needed something to cling to. No one drank it. Jonathan rubbed a hand over his face, still trying to grasp the scope of what had just landed on them. "So what happens now?" he asked. Henry closed the folder with finality. "Ms. Dawson has 30 days to submit her judgment in writing. That document will be reviewed by our legal team, but the final moral authority lies with her. If she deems Ms. Kingsley unfit in character, the inheritance will be placed in trust until such time that Jonathan Montgomery either marries a qualified candidate or forms a board to manage it charitably." Lauren scoffed. "So you're telling me some glorified janitor gets to decide whether I'm honest enough to be a Montgomery?" Ellie didn't blink. "I'm telling you," she said quietly, "that character isn't something you inherit. It's something you prove. And I've been watching you prove it every day." Her voice wasn't cruel, but neither was it soft. It was earned. Jonathan stood in place, still grappling with the realization that his father had engineered this. "He never trusted her," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "He suspected something all along." Ellie stepped forward, not to accuse, but to confirm. "He didn't know the details. But he said it in his own way. He said you were blind to her, and that power makes men blind faster than love." Jonathan looked down, his face pale. "And you? You've been, reporting on us this whole time?" Ellie shook her head. "I've been protecting what he asked me to. Nothing more. Nothing less." Lauren let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "So now what, Dawson? You get to play judge, tell everyone how noble you are while the rest of us just grovel for your approval?" Ellie's eyes met hers. "I don't need groveling. I just need truth." Her voice didn't waver. And in that moment, Jonathan saw it clearly. Not just the woman in front of him, but the woman he had never really seen at all. And so the revelation sat heavy in the center of the room, like the final chess move in a match none of them realized had already been lost. Lauren, red with fury, left without a word, slamming the door behind her. Jonathan remained in silence, not moving, not defending. Henry handed Ellie a sealed envelope with formal instructions and left her with a nod that acknowledged more than just duty. It acknowledged dignity. And Ellie, still standing in the middle of the room, held the envelope like a weightless anchor. She had no desire to destroy anyone. But she would no longer let silence protect what truth needed to undo. The testament wasn't about money, it never had been. It was about integrity. And Robert Montgomery, though buried, still knew exactly what was coming. It didn't start with a scream. It started with stillness, too much of it. Jonathan had been staring at the child's face for what felt like hours, the infant sleeping peacefully in his arms, unaware of the storm about to descend. The doubts, once only whispers in the corners of his mind, had become full voices, relentless and loud. When Lauren entered the room, her heels tapping against the floor, she found him exactly where she'd left him, but different. He was quiet in a new way. He didn't look at her right away. "Close the door," he said calmly. She hesitated, sensing something was off, but obeyed. He waited until the click echoed before speaking. "Tell me again," he said, not looking up. "What happened the night of the storm? Every minute of it. From the beginning." She froze. "Why are you asking me this?" "Just tell me," he repeated, voice calm but cold. Lauren began her story, almost word for word from the last time, but this time Jonathan listened like a man looking for cracks, and they appeared. In the timeline, in the details, in the way her voice faltered when she said Marcus's name. And when Jonathan finally looked up at her, he asked the question that shattered it all. "Is he mine?" Lauren didn't answer right away. Her face twitched, and for a split second he saw panic. Then it was gone. She forced a laugh, too sharp to be natural. Of course he's yours. What kind of question is that? But it was too late. He'd seen it, that flicker of truth she hadn't meant to show. Jonathan stood slowly, holding the baby tighter. "You've been lying to me," he said, "not a question, just a fact. The anonymous messages, the glitter on Marcus's collar, the sabotage of the security system. You think I'm a fool?" "John, please," Lauren said, stepping closer, her voice softening. "You're tired. This whole week has been—" "Don't!" he snapped, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard from him. "Don't tell me how I feel. Just tell me the truth." Her silence confirmed everything. And then, finally, she crumbled. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus and it was never meant to last." Jonathan's chest rose and fell, the betrayal hitting him in waves. "So you thought you'd give me his child and hope I'd never notice?" Lauren's voice cracked. "You wouldn't have, if it weren't for her." The venom in her was unmistakable. Ellie. Marcus was called in next. He entered stiffly, clearly aware the jig was up. Jonathan didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he just asked, "Is he yours?" Marcus looked at the floor. "I didn't know for sure," he said quietly. "I hope not, but yes." Jonathan nodded, the weight of it finally too much. "You were supposed to protect my family," he said, voice thick. "You drove my mother to chemo. You carried my father's casket. You were in my house, and all this time, you were with her." Marcus looked up, tears forming. "I didn't plan it, Jonathan. She came to me. I should have said no. I didn't. And I'm sorry for everything. But apologies meant nothing now." "Get out," Jonathan said simply. "You're fired. I don't want to see you again." Marcus nodded and left, silent and ashamed. Lauren tried to speak, but Jonathan raised a hand. "Don't," he said. "I don't need any more of your stories." She reached out anyway. "He's still just a baby," she pleaded. "He doesn't know what any of this means." "But I do," Jonathan said, and turned away from her. The baby stirred, as if reacting to the shift in energy in the room. Alone again, Jonathan sank onto the sofa and cradled the infant against his chest. His hands trembled, but he didn't cry. He just stared down at the boy with wide, uncertain eyes. "You didn't ask for this," he whispered. "You didn't choose who your mother is, or your father." The baby let out a tiny sigh and gripped Jonathan's shirt with his tiny fist. That small gesture shattered something inside him. Jonathan pressed his lips together and closed his eyes, letting the pain hit him without resistance. "I don't know who I am right now," he said quietly, "but I know who I want to be for you." When the child shifted again, Jonathan pulled him closer. "You're not my blood," he said, his voice steadying, "but you're my choice." The words weren't poetic, they weren't grand, but they were true. In that moment, he became a father, not by biology, but by decision. And maybe that was the harder, braver way. He wasn't trying to be noble, he was just trying to love the child in his arms without conditions. That was the only thing that still made sense. Across the hall, Ellie had been standing just beyond the threshold, unnoticed, watching it all unfold through the slight crack in the doorway. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when the confrontation started, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. She saw the pain in Jonathan's eyes. She saw the collapse of a man who had believed in a life built on lies, and she saw the strength it took for him to choose the baby anyway. As he cradled the child, whispering something she couldn't hear, Ellie felt tears begin to stream down her cheeks. Not loud sobs, just silent, aching grief. Grief for the child, born into a storm he hadn't caused. Grief for Jonathan, who had loved blindly and been cut deeply. But also grief for herself, for the woman she could have been if someone had chosen her that way. If someone had looked at her, broken and silent, and said, "You're not mine. But I choose you anyway." Her arms ached with memory, not just from the delivery, but from all the lives she had once held and lost. And yet, she stayed quiet. Because this moment didn't belong to her. It belonged to a father and a child, and the choice that changed them both. In the quiet that followed the storm of truth, Ellie turned away and wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her heart was full of sorrow, yes, but also of something that tasted almost like peace. She had seen love break, but she had also seen it rebuilt. Jonathan had been shattered, but he hadn't walked away. He had claimed a child who bore none of his features and all of his strength. And for that, Ellie didn't need to say a word. She just closed the door softly behind her, leaving the two of them in that fragile, sacred moment. The child was not his blood, but he was his choice. And sometimes that was the kind of truth that healed more than any lie ever could. The scandal didn't fade quietly. It erupted. Within days, the story of the Montgomery heir's secret betrayal flooded local headlines and eventually reached national outlets. The baby, the bride, and the maid who knew everything, one tabloid screamed. But the truth, as always, was more complex than headlines could carry. Cameras crowded outside the Montgomery estate, and journalists camped by the gates of Greenridge Hills. What no one expected was how the story shifted. The narrative quickly turned not on Lauren or Marcus, but on the woman who had once been invisible. Dr. Eleanor Dawson, formerly forgotten, became the center of national fascination. The maid who delivered justice trended online. News anchors spoke her name with reverence. Mothers wrote letters thanking her for what she stood for. Survivors whispered, "She's one of us." And through it all, Ellie remained quiet. Not because she feared the spotlight, but because it wasn't what she had ever wanted. She had stepped forward not for fame, but for one child, one truth. But then came the invitation, sealed in gold, signed with a name she never thought she'd see again, Robert Montgomery. A posthumous directive, a final request, an offer to lead Healing Hands, the very clinic he had dreamed into existence. The meeting was held in a quiet conference room inside a community center on the edge of Hartford. There were no chandeliers, no butlers, no marble floors. Just a round table, a stack of papers, and 3 board members who looked at Ellie with equal parts respect and uncertainty. Robert believed in second chances, one of them said. He didn't just want a name on a wall. He wanted someone who knew what it meant to be forgotten and to rise anyway. Ellie listened, hands folded, her heart beating not with nerves, but with the quiet pulse of destiny calling. She hadn't worn white since her license was stripped. Now, a new lab coat sat folded before her on the table, fresh pressed and embroidered with her name, Dr. Eleanor Dawson, medical director. She touched the fabric with reverence, not nostalgia. This wasn't a return. It was a rebirth. "I'll do it," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't need to ask why she was chosen. Robert had seen what others didn't. He saw a woman who had fallen, but never stopped healing. Now she would build a place where others like her could stand again too. The first day at Healing Hands wasn't grand. There were no ribbon cuttings or speeches, just patients, women of every shade, shape, and sorrow. They came in with bruises that wouldn't heal, hearts that wouldn't quiet, and eyes that had long forgotten what safety looked like. Ellie greeted each one personally, taking histories, listening more than she spoke. Every intake was a mirror, every silence, a story she had once lived. She didn't promise to save everyone. She didn't pretend to fix what the world had shattered. She only offered space. And that sometimes was enough. Word spread quickly. The waiting list grew. Volunteers arrived. Donations trickled in, then poured. And through it all, Ellie walked the halls in her white coat, not as a symbol of authority, but as proof that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a choice made over and over. Her days were long, her heart tired, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Not because the world had finally seen her, but because she had chosen to stop hiding from herself. Jonathan came by often, always holding the child close, like he feared letting go would somehow undo everything he had reclaimed. He brought blankets, books, diapers, and, when no one was looking, baked muffins he claimed were from the store. The baby grew quickly, all curious eyes and crooked smiles, and though he still didn't resemble Jonathan, something in the way he clung to him made blood irrelevant. "He says your name now," Jonathan told Ellie one day, standing in the staff break room. She raised a brow, skeptical. "Does he?" Jonathan nodded. "Well, close enough. Tia Doc." Ellie laughed softly for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I'll take it." The boy waddled toward her a few moments later, arms outstretched. Ellie bent down, scooped him up, and held him against her chest. He laid his head there easily, naturally, as if some part of him recognized her from the very beginning. And maybe he did. Maybe children always knew who had carried them through fire, even when words failed. One afternoon, Ellie found herself alone in the exam room, reviewing patient notes, when her reflection in the medical cabinet caught her off guard. She saw the lab coat, the clean lines of purpose returned, the steady hands. But behind the collar, behind the confidence, she saw the woman who had once knelt on a marble floor with shaking fingers, coaxing a life into the world, while no one believed she should be there. That woman hadn't disappeared. She had simply evolved. The trauma still lived in her bones, but it no longer wrote her story. Healing Hands wasn't just a clinic, it was a declaration, a place for women like her, like the ones who filled her waiting room daily, mothers with no husbands, daughters with no homes, wives with no voices. Ellie made a point of learning every name, not for documentation, for dignity. Every chart was written with care, every scar noticed, every silence respected. There were days she went home too tired to speak, but not once did she doubt why she was there. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to break the way she did, just to be heard. And as the weeks turned into months, and the line outside the clinic stretched longer, something remarkable happened. Ellie stopped feeling like she was reclaiming something. She began to feel like she was creating something entirely new, not just for the patients, for herself. When Jonathan and the baby visited on Saturdays, the entire clinic seemed to breathe differently. The staff called them our boys, and the baby, who now said Tia Doc so clearly it made Ellie's chest ache, always ran to her with a grin that made everything worth it. Each step forward felt like a stitch, mending something old and sacred. Every woman who walked out of Healing Hands stood taller, and Ellie, she stood with them. The new badge didn't erase the pain of the past, but it did what healing always does. It reminded her that scars weren't signs of shame. They were proof that she had survived. And in this place, in this clinic Robert had only dreamed of, she was helping others survive too. One patient at a time. One promise at a time. On the final day of autumn, Ellie sat quietly in the garden of the Montgomery estate, the same garden she used to pass without acknowledgement, her presence barely registering to those who called the mansion home. Now she sat not as a worker, not as a shadow, but as a woman who had survived the fire and emerged whole. The oak trees stood tall around her, their leaves surrendering to gravity in burnt shades of orange and gold. But Ellie felt no sense of ending. For the first time in years, she felt stillness without fear. She watched the fountain trickle steadily and folded her hands in her lap, unaware that she was holding her breath. The space around her, once a symbol of exclusion, now seemed to hum with something gentler, belonging. And then came the sound she hadn't realized she was waiting for, footsteps on gravel, slow and sure. She looked up, and there was Jonathan, walking toward her with the baby nestled securely in his arms. He wasn't dressed like a man of wealth or legacy today. He looked like a man who had chosen something truer. "He wanted to see you," he said with a quiet smile, "but the truth is, so did I." Jonathan didn't speak right away, and Ellie didn't press. Silence. Between them now was not absence, it was comfort. He took a breath, knelt in front of her, and adjusted the baby, who had grown sturdier, more curious, and full of that wild innocence only children could carry. "You've done more than save us, Ellie," Jonathan said finally, his voice breaking just enough to show it mattered. "You've rebuilt me, rebuilt him. You gave us more than truth. You gave us a chance to love honestly." He paused, eyes glassy. "So I have to ask, not because we need you, but because we want you. Will you stay? Not just in the clinic, not just here and there, but with us, as family." Ellie blinked, stunned by the simplicity and weight of the words. She had spent years preparing herself to be needed, by patients, by strangers, by crises, but to be wanted. That was a language she hadn't dared to relearn. She looked at Jonathan, at the boy who now mirrored some of Marcus's features, but all of Jonathan's gentleness, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, not caution, but peace. A quiet yes that hadn't yet reached her lips, but was already flooding her heart. The baby squirmed slightly in Jonathan's arms, stretching out toward her with an urgency that felt ancient, as if somewhere in his marrow he remembered her hands cradling him into life. And then, like a thread pulled through time, he said it, not loudly, not perfectly, but with clarity only Ellie could hear. Ellie. Just her name. Just that. But it undid her. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of something she had never dared to imagine. She had become someone worth remembering. The baby reached again, impatient, and this time Jonathan gently handed him over. He nestled into her chest like he had done on that night of storms and betrayal, but now without fear or confusion, only trust. "He says it all the time now," Jonathan murmured. "But I think today, he knew it meant something more." Ellie pressed her cheek against the boy's head, closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm here." It wasn't just a response to the child. It was a promise to herself, to the life she was choosing, not out of guilt, not out of duty, but because she wanted to. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ellie allowed herself to believe she hadn't been broken by the past. She had been preserved by it, carried through every unfair trial, not to be discarded, but to be delivered here, to this moment. She wasn't who she used to be. She wasn't who they had once painted her to be. She was someone new, not made by titles or resumes or even forgiveness, but by staying, by loving, by choosing not to run when everything inside her had once been trained to flee. She had found healing in the clinic, yes, but this was different. This was home. She looked at Jonathan and saw no need to explain anything. They had seen each other at their worst, had stood in the ashes together. There was nothing left to prove, just the long, quiet work of building a future, a family, not perfect, not untouched by grief, but real. And that to Ellie was everything. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the garden fell into gentle dusk, Ellie leaned her head back and listened to Jonathan talk to the baby about birds and seasons and silly things only fathers know how to make important. She didn't interrupt. She just held the child close and let his tiny hand rest on her collar, right over the spot where her name was stitched into the lab coat she now wore like skin. She thought about all the times she had knelt on cold floors, swallowed her voice, or turned her back to truth for survival. And yet, she was still here, still choosing, still healing. It wasn't a dramatic redemption. No one would write songs about it. But for Ellie, this was the only kind of miracle that mattered. Quiet, steady, freely given. A miracle you don't need to earn, only receive and give back. Because sometimes she now understood what changes a life isn't a grand choice or a public vindication. It's a cry in the night, a breath held and then released, a name spoken for the first time, its hands reaching across silence. A baby's arms, reaching for a woman who once thought she'd never be chosen. A man kneeling not in apology, but in invitation. A final moment of stillness in the place where everything had begun. On cold floors, beneath chandeliers, among people who once never saw her. And now, here in the garden, with leaves falling like soft reminders of seasons past, Ellie knew she hadn't lost everything. She had been rebuilt, repurposed. This was the end of something, yes, but more than that, it was the beginning of where love stays. This story took days of care, writing, and heart to bring to life, and we created it thinking of you. If this journey moved you even a little, please consider subscribing to our channel. It's the best way to help us keep bringing more stories that matter. We'd also love to hear from you. What moment in this story touched you the most? Leave us a comment, and if you feel like it, explore the other stories we've shared here. Thank you for being with us. Your presence truly means the world.